Okay, so this is time to put that table on the side. Actually, we're going to continue it, but we're going to continue that in a different form in a few minutes here. This is a blogger and author on LouRockwell.com. He is a very good friend of the Liberty Movement. He has written about Ferguson and other police matters, and not to mention, he also wrote about something very interesting, which we'll get into in a few minutes here. And he's probably one of the best writers in the libertarian movement. Please welcome Will and Grigg. Will, how you doing?
Good evening. Thank you so much for those generous remarks and that very kind introduction. I really appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Okay, so we were just talking about Ferguson, in case you haven't noticed here. And there's some evidence that came out, and I think that to start this off with, the less than 2 minutes evidence that Michael Brown ended up getting killed, I'm having a hard time swallowing it. I don't know if it's me or if the evidence is for real, but what do you make of this entire investigation and a lot of the other evidence that has come out, or the lack of a lot of evidence in this case? I mean, was Michael Brown the typical thug that we despise here in America, or is there a case to be made against Officer Darren Wilson? I mean, what's the real skinny on this?
The most important piece of evidence is one that is conspicuous by its omission, and that is the incident report from Officer Wilson after the shooting. And just in the last day or so, the newspaper there in St. Louis has released the product of a Freedom of Information Act request that includes security camera footage from the police station of Mr. Wilson leaving in the company of another officer and the police union attorney, and then returning from the hospital. And in both of those very brief video clips, he's not visibly injured, and when he returns from the hospital, he's not wearing bandages. So that should put to rest, although it probably won't, the idea that he was beaten severely enough that he required medical treatment for an orbital blowout fracture or something of that sort. That appears to be a deathless canard that's still in circulation. But the point that I found most compelling about this is that he was in the company of other police officers and the union attorney for a number of hours the day of the shooting, and yet we don't have an incident report from Officer Wilson. And what that means is that the story, that for all I know, could still be very much a work in progress. So what happens when you have a police shooting of this sort is that there's a process that I call the road to inevitable vindication. Because
right.
Usually what will happen is that a police officer will immediately invoke his Garrity privilege. That's right. A Supreme Court ruling having to do with investigation of misconduct by government employees. And shielded by the Garrity immunity, he will discuss with a police union attorney and with investigators one version or whatever version of the event that first occurs to him. And it can only be used for the purpose of an internal investigation. It cannot be used for civil prosecution or criminal prosecution. And then after huddling with a police union attorney, what they will do is they will sculpt the story to fit the facts that emerge from the investigation. They'll fix the story around the disclosures rather than getting the original story from the shooter the way that you would in any other homicide investigation. We don't have the original story from Officer Wilson. We don't really have an
That's an excellent point.
Yeah, we don't really have an indication from the evidence that came forward today that he was aware that Brown was a suspect in a robbery at the time of their initial encounter. And that's a very important point, because he was not pursuing Brown as a suspected felon in a strong-arm robbery. He was annoyed that Brown and Dorian Johns were walking in the middle of the road. Now, the St. Louis newspaper says that sources tell them that after the initial encounter, at that point, Officer Wilson identified Brown as matching the description of the suspect in the strong-arm robbery. But there's nothing in any of the recorded chatter, any of the dispatch communications that have been made available through the Freedom of Information Act request, Nothing in any of those conversations to validate the idea that this identification is ever made. Unnamed sources, most likely with the prosecutor's office, have said that to the paper, but we don't have any corroboration for that. So for all we know, this simply was a case where Officer Wilson became peeved that these two people were walking down the middle of the street and they didn't immediately defer to his command, and that it escalated pointlessly from there. But in any case, as things stand right now, what we're most likely to see will be a no bill from the grand jury because of the way that the investigation was structured and the unique set of privileges and immunities that attach to police officers when they kill somebody.
Right. I guess, what really gets me going is that, some of the people are saying in the press that, the city of Ferguson, or at least some of the residents there, are just basically preparing and embracing for another set of riots should Officer Wilson not be indicted and he's dismissed and that he's able to return to duty in light of everything that's happened so far. Do you think that there's going to be another riot happening? And do you think that this is just going to be another way for the officials in the Ferguson Police Department just to say, oh, well, this is tough luck. I mean, you're not going to get your indictment, so shut the hell up. The grand jury's made its decision, what have you. I mean, what do you think?
I earnestly hope that we're not going to see a riot, and I'm desperately afraid that we will. And I think that a number of things that have been done have been calculated for the purpose of trying to incite that type of reaction. Witness the fact that the police chief in Ferguson announced today or yesterday that assuming that Wilson is acquitted, or no bill rather, by the grand jury, that he'll be immediately reinstated to duty in a town where obviously his services are no longer necessary, helpful, or wanted. That's, I think, a calculated insult. It's a calculated provocation. I do think that most of the people who were involved in the protests earlier, from what I was able to see, had no interest in setting fire or looting property that belonged to others. We saw plenty of instances where people who lived in Ferguson were attacked on their own property by the riot police, who were hurling tear gas grenades and flashbang grenades onto the property of people who remained in their own homes. And that's what's been calculated to provoke the type of reaction that would justify and validate the actions of the police.
Right.
And we do know that a number of people arrive from outside the town for the purpose of pouring accelerant on whatever sparks of discontent they could find. There are people who are professional agitators of that sort and simply do it as a hobby. And we're going to have people of that sort show up, unfortunately. But I do think, once again, that the process was rigged from the beginning, as almost all police shooting inquiries are rigged. The presumption is that a police officer is a privileged aggressor. As a matter of fact, if you read the Missouri statute on justifiable homicide, it says that explicitly.
Right. Not
in that specific phrase, but in the sense that you don't have, as a police officer, the same requirement not to engage in aggression that you do as a member of the productive class, as somebody who's not a police officer. And you've got Mr. McCulloch there in St. Louis County, somebody who has never prosecuted a police officer for abuse of power, let alone for an improper use of force. In his universe, the actions of a police officer are self-ratifying, and they don't need to be justified. What needs to be justified would be the behavior of the private citizens on the receiving end of that force.
So basically, the way we're supposed to take it is that the actions of a police officer in response to any commotion that's happening in a nearby community is commensurate with his supposed training or what's in his handbook, especially when his supervisors are basically saying, yeah, you can go draw out your guns and you can go and shoot the motherfucker while he has his hands up in the air and empty your clip while you're at it. I mean, would that be probably the most logical assessment of that kind of mentality that's often associated with police departments.
Well, they define success as coming home safely at the end of a shift. And once that's established as your priority, then it stands to reason that any other consideration would be subordinated to the holy imperative of officer safety. And there's what I've referred to as a catechism of self-justification you hear from police. Every time that they beat somebody or shoot somebody, it usually begins with the idea that he made a furtive gesture, he bladed his body, he took a fighting stance, he aggressed against me, I was in fear for my life, I feared for the safety of myself and other people on the scene. These things are drilled into them in, once again, the form of a catechism, and they're routinely reviewed practically every month, if not more frequently than that. Police officers are going to receive fresh training on the latest language and postures regarding justification for the use of force. And this is something that is recited once they're protected by the Garrity invocation after a shooting or another lethal force incident, is that they always review it with an eye towards validating what the officer did. And that's exactly the opposite of the procedure that's applied when you're talking about a homicide suspect who's not part of the exalted brotherhood of state-sanctioned coercion. If you're somebody who makes a claim of self-defense in the state of Missouri in exactly the same circumstances, but you're not employed as a dispenser of violence on behalf of the state, that is to say a police officer, then you're not a privileged aggressor, and your story will be taken down immediately after the event.
Right.
And any subsequent evidence that is discovered or any changes in your story will be compared against your original story to impeach your credibility. And that's never the case when you're talking about a police officer in Missouri or anywhere else. Good heavens, if you take a look at jurisdictions like Clark County, Nevada, or Houston, Las Vegas or Houston, the memory of man runneth not to a time when a police officer has been found guilty of an unjustified killing and prosecuted for the same. It's just not viewed as something that is within the purview of mortal law, the review of a police officer's actions that would result in that kind of accountability. And that's something that's systemic and it's nationwide. And I think that in the case of Ferguson and some of those other little towns in St. Louis County, you have a police force that behaves very much like an occupying army. They extract revenue at gunpoint for the benefit of a political class that is in no way representative of the population they supposedly serve. And this has been the case now for the better part of a century. There was a fascinating study that was done a couple of months ago and published by a scholar working with one of the notorious sort of left-leaning or progressive think tanks. In this case, he actually did a good job in examining critically what had been done in terms of government policy in order to prevent the emergence of a black middle class in little towns like Ferguson. It's called The Making of Ferguson. The author's name is Richard Rothstein. He's with the Economic Policy Institute, and of course that's very much a centrist, which is to say statist think tank. The Making of Ferguson, Public Policies at the Root of Its Troubles. And what he's saying is that you have government intervention in the marketplace there, in the economic marketplace, the housing marketplace particularly, for the purpose of preventing the emergence of a black middle class in towns like Ferguson and other towns there in St. Louis County. It began under Woodrow Wilson, actually, and Harold Ickes and some of the other luminaries of the New Deal were involved. And you take a look at the Great Society, the same problems were manifested and amplified. The progressives, in other words, created a ghetto. And that ghetto is now being administered by a white, largely democratic political machine that is supported and sustained by a police force that is wildly unrepresentative of the population and completely unaccountable. And so when you have a flashpoint of this sort happen in a town like Ferguson, you have a situation where, irrespective of what we learn about the actions of Michael Brown and Darian Wilson as individuals, it's perceived in larger terms as sort of a microcosm of the injustices they've been putting up with. And quite frankly, as far as I can tell, these are legitimate grievances that have nothing necessarily to do with the larger politics of racial grievance being peddled by the likes of Jesse Jackson. This has to do with the fact that they're living in a community that is a planned community. It's as much a planned community as some of the experiments in central planning we saw in Eastern Europe. And the role that was played by Darren Wilson was not that of protecting life, liberty, and property. It was administering that political order. We saw that in response to the riots as well. None of the riot police did anything to protect any of the businesses there when they were the focus of violence. They weren't there in order to protect protect property. As a matter of fact, property owners called for police assistance. They were told that wasn't a priority. The priority was to make a political statement about control rather than to come to the aid of somebody who was suffering criminal violence. And that's by no means Ferguson.
Well, didn't the Supreme Court themselves rule that, like, that's not the place of the police force in the U.S. anymore, is to defend person and property? Like, they have no responsibility to us to begin with.
Yeah, that's
not just Ferguson.
I'm really glad to see that a lot of people are at least becoming disabused of the idea that the police exist in any sense to protect our property. The cliche is, well, you work for us because we pay your salary. And, of course, that's not true. Strictly speaking, of course, the salary is paid by the people who steal our wealth through taxes, and their loyalty would be to the people who sign the paychecks that are backed by the plundered wealth that the police are involved in harvesting, the police and other people in the regulatory state. And as you point out, the Supreme Court has handed down not one but several rulings recognizing that no police officer has an enforceable civil responsibility or legal responsibility to come to the aid of an individual, a particular individual who's suffering a specific threat to person or property, including, interestingly enough, people who are informants or otherwise the recipients of promises of special protection by the police. Those are not enforceable because that's not the role of the police.
But isn't that largely a problem that's happening largely because of the war on drugs? Because John McWhorter, who appeared on Stossel a while back, made very much of a direct reference to that, because what's happening is that the war on drugs has contributed to officers looking for drugs in low-income black communities, and especially in impoverished communities, where the war on drugs has been waged on young black men arrested for supposed amounts of marijuana and possibly other illegal narcotics on their person. When in a lot of cases, there's been a lot of rumors and a lot of allegations over the years, most of which has been indiscriminately proven, that these types of drugs and whatnot have been planted on these young men to make it look like, well, okay, he was, he had this possession of this narcotic on him, but almost at the same time, the cop was the one who must have planted it on him. And because they have these types of narcotics and stolen evidence lockers, hey, if we can make an example of this kid because he looked the wrong way, he looked, inappropriate in terms of his attire, the swagger, the move, his pants being pulled down to his ankles. I mean, that, I think, really plays a part in it, doesn't it?
I would go so far as to say that the very existence of drug prohibition itself is rooted in certain assumptions about race and certain designs for structuring society in a way that reflects a racial hierarchy. If you take a look at the perfectly demented rhetoric of the people who went seamlessly from the alcohol prohibition into drug prohibition or marijuana regulation and prohibition in the 1930s, they are almost comically, cartoonishly obsessed with the idea that marijuana specifically would turn young black men into what we would now call super predators. And you've heard echoes of this rhetoric just in the last couple of weeks, where one autopsy report revealed that apparently there were traces of THC in the bloodstream of Michael Brown. Of course, this is something that hangs on for a very long time. THC tends to be very durable in the bloodstream.
I'm glad you brought that up.
It's not as if that's evidence that he'd been smoking that day or he'd smoking the day before. It could have been a week earlier. That's one of the oddities about THC. But you actually saw some people say, well, this would suggest that he would have been hallucinating and hyper-aggressive, because everybody knows that's the natural impact of cannabis on the nervous system, is that it makes you into an aggressor. Well, that's Harry Anslinger's idea from the 1930s, that...
And that's passed down from generation to generation because...
Yeah, of course, he was deliriously self-contradictory about that, too. Depending upon the specific set of social circumstances and the rhetorical needs of the moment, he would say in the 1930s that marijuana would turn you into an aggressive sex fiend. But in the 1950s, when suddenly we were all ramped up about the idea that the communists were going to take over the world and we had to mobilize the youth in order to hold the red myrmidons at bay, he was saying, well, the problem with marijuana is it'll make you torpid and indifferent, and so we won't be able to turn you into the type of hyper-aggressive super soldier we need in order to deal with the Russians. It's completely contradictory in a matter of a generation, less than a generation, a matter of decades. You know, Anslinger had gone from saying that marijuana will make you into a berserker to saying that marijuana will turn you into a hippie. And in any case, nobody knows exactly what the effects of THC would have been on Michael Brown because we don't know how much he consumed. We don't know when he consumed it. But that's something that's sort of a residual effect of a lot of this rhetoric that is overtly racial in its nature, and it's very much part of the warp and weave of drug prohibition. And you're right in terms of the way that it has mobilized police in order to be the custodians, supposedly, of the bloodstreams and the physical persons of your young people, black people in particular. That's something that does result in the type of escalation we're talking about, where people are stopped and frisked on the streets of New York City in defiance of repeated court orders. That's still very much going on. If you take a look what happened, though, specifically in St. Louis County, there was a tremendous study done by Arch City Defenders, which is a consortium of defense attorneys, public counsel, publicly appointed defense counsel. They went and crunched the numbers about the citations being issued in St. Louis County, and then they used a number of statistical databases that were compiled by the state, I believe pursuant to some kind of a federal administrative order. And they pointed out that black people, black motorists specifically in St. Louis County, were far likelier to be stopped and cited and arrested in spite of the fact that statistically white drivers were likelier to be in possession of contraband. So there's actually a lower measurable rate of black people in possession of substances that the government wants to prohibit than white drivers in possession of the same substances. And yet they have a far higher rate of stops, far higher rate of citation, and a far higher rate of prosecution. And they get fed into a perfectly horrible judicial system there that turns them into paupers. If there's any kind of progress they're making, if they found any kind of traction at all economically, you know, one encounter with a police officer in St. Louis County is enough to ruin your life because you'll be fed into the system with no realistic prospect of improving your circumstances. And Michael Brown's mother made that point the day that her son was killed. I've tried so hard to keep him in school, tried so hard to keep him on the straight and narrow, tried to teach him to behave and discipline himself and try to avoid all these pitfalls. And now he's lying there. His mortal remains are lying there dead in the street like a gutted animal.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting you bring that up because there was talk about, you know, how this young man was, you know, his mother was actually arrived in the back in the parking lot of some location. I can't remember which one it was, but maybe you know exactly where I'm going with this. Apparently, she was handing out flyers and she was, you know, trying to get people to see, you know, about this whole situation with her son. And well, I mean, I'm just thinking to myself, you know, the family has gone through so much that this family has really endured a lot. And for his name to be dragged through the mud because, yeah, you know something, a lot of people just want to say, you know, systematically and automatically, yeah, this kid's a thug because he held up a convenience store robbery, which is, and the jury's still out on that one as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, there really is no conclusive evidence because it's not like he was looking at the tape wearing a neon sign, I'm Mike Brown, this is me, holding up a convenience store, I got a gun here. I mean, you know, it's not like he's trying to cause that much attention. And then all of a sudden, Oh, lo and behold, there was a robbery that went on. The description was a black male wearing a hoodie, and he had a pal, you know. There was also another tape out there that was coming from the same store that showed that he paid for.
It was ambiguous, yeah.
It was very ambiguous.
There was some ambiguity as to whether there was actually money tendered for the transaction. That wouldn't explain the little confrontation with the clerk. I don't know what happened there. The problem is that they cleared the case by shooting the suspect. And that, unfortunately, is a pretty good illustration of one of the terrible things about government law enforcement. It's the worst possible way to deal with actual crimes against property that would involve an attempt to make restitution to the victim. If Michael Brown actually stole a $40 or $50 package of cigars, or if he had paid too little, once again, it looks as if money was tendered there. I don't know. Apparently, Dorian Johnson was talked into taking responsibility for a robbery, and that's second or third-hand hearsay. We don't know whether or not that was actually said. But the point is, if he actually stole these cigars, then the objective should be to retrieve the cigars and give them back to the owner and then make Mike Brown pay restitution to the owner. But they cleared the case, and this is something that the Ferguson Police Department did put out.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, they cleared the case by shooting the suspect without solving the crime.
Right.
And
excellent point.
The other thing I want to point out regarding Mike Brown's mother and some of the things that have been said about her, there was a report a couple of days ago to the effect that she was being charged with robbery in a dispute that involved memorabilia, something involving the likeness of her son on a T-shirt.
That's what I was actually referring to.
Taking that charge at face value and saying that that represents a reliable construction of the available facts here, that she's charged with robbery under ambiguous circumstances. We're pointing out that Darren Wilson's mother was a convicted thief and con artist who spent several years in prison while she was a single mother raising him. So I don't know anything about the family background of Michael Brown that would illustrate that he's in some sense genetically inclined towards a life of crime. But you could say that about Darren Wilson, assuming, of course, that this is genetically determined. I don't believe that. I'm not a determinist. But that's one of the things being put into the information stream by way of building this caricature of Michael Brown as the young black super predator, is that his mother is criminally inclined. We don't know that about his mother, but we do know that about Darren Wilson's late mother. May she rest in peace.
Right. Does anybody have any questions for Will Grigg on this topic, or other than Will Collins?
Yes, I have a question. Will, this is Jim Babb. It's great to have you on the program.
Thank you. I appreciate being here.
I'm just really kind of fascinated. I guess I have two questions. The first one is kind of an easy one. Every time we hear about a victim, there's always this quick explanation when they want to get sympathy for them and say, oh, well, this young person was headed for college. They feel like they need to explain something, or a straight A student. Like they feel the need to put these disclaimers in, like being a human being isn't enough. That somehow these victims, it's not just enough to be a person, but they have to say, no, a good person, really. What is it about is it just there's so many victims that are portrayed as thugs that this is just a sort of a response to that?
I think they did try to preempt the inevitable efforts to tarnish his image. That's part of the familiar routine here. Every time the police shoot somebody, the default assumption on the part of people of the sadist inclination is that the person on the receiving end is coming. And it's one of the reasons I've talked about what I call the Tom Joad test. You remember that famous soliloquy from Grapes of Wrath where Tom Joad says, among other things, wherever you find a cop beating on a guy, I'll be there. Presumably identifying with the victim of police violence. So what I've said is that it tells a lot about the person, how he reacts to the spectacle of an agent of the state inflicting violence on somebody. Does he assume that the person wielding the truncheon is in the right and that the person on the receiving end must be depraved? Or does he look at this and say, look, the fellow there wearing the government-issued costume and wielding a club has to justify what he's doing. By what right are you hitting that man? Now, the latter attitude I contend is the American perspective, because the great promise of America was that government was going to have to justify itself. not merely justifying what government agents do, but the very existence of government. That's something that this gloriously seditious document, the Declaration of Independence, makes clear. The existence of government is contingent. Our rights are non-negotiable, but government better damn well justify its own existence. And that should apply when you see somebody in the state inflicting violence on somebody. But unfortunately, people have been indoctrinated into the belief that if somebody's receiving that kind of attention from the police, then that person has it coming to them. And that's part of the cops syndrome. People have been marinated in cops and imitators to the point where they just assume that somebody must be a skell, a perp, a crook, a criminal, a thug, a super predator, and so forth. So I think that Michael Brown's family and friends were trying to get out ahead of that very familiar demonization trend, the demonization dynamic. But the other thing that happens, I think, is that you really see an effort on the part of people to justify themselves without becoming the targets of police violence, particularly when you're talking about people of that background. My big problem here, and I think that you hit it very perfectly when you said that the fact that he's a person means that there's something there that must be respected and protected. Even if you were to assume that he was a thug, even if he were a robber, at that point he's a criminal suspect. He's not a criminal, he's a criminal suspect. Because there's a whole procedure that has to be gone through before we determine that this person has actually done something that justifies punishment. But people have been primed to believe in on-the-spot summary punishment for, among other things, this...
an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth mentality.
The really interesting thing about Lex Talanis, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, I did a program about this on my podcast a couple of weeks ago, is that the ancient principle is actually supposed to limit what people can do by way of seeking some kind of compensation. If somebody, puts out an eye, you're not entitled to make him blind. There's got to be proportionality. And the way that it was actually described in the ancient Hebrew writings was that everybody in the system was subject to that principle, including the people who administered it. And one of the very important parts of Lex Talanis that's very, very much ignored today and not well understood is that there were really severe penalties for perjury and corruption of justice. So that if a judge in that system, for instance, or the equivalent of a prosecutor, withheld evidence or misrepresented the facts so as to convict an innocent man and their imposture was detected, they would have to serve the sentence that they were going to inflict upon the innocently accused victim. So what that would mean, for instance, is that if you, as an American prosecutor, don't provide Brady material, don't provide discovery to the defense, and somebody's wrongfully convicted and goes to prison, and then they find the evidence, he's released from prison, you go and finish his sentence. I like that idea, assuming that we're going to have something in this penal system. But, I like what you say about eye for an eye and tooth for tooth, and the idea is that people just assume that if you're on the receiving end of police violence, then you must be doing something that's wrong, and that would justify that kind of treatment, but they don't have enough moral imagination to understand just how easily that could happen to them.
I'm going to say it like it is. I think the American people in this country, whether they want to acknowledge it or not, deal with it or not, believe it or not, accept it or not, or embrace it or not, lack moral convictions when it comes to this matter. They like to think that they have this moral absolute mindset of what is right and wrong, but the fact of the matter is, there is this very warped, twisted version of moral absolutism, and especially in matters of law and the legal system, because they really think that, if we just go after this kid, if we can actually arrest him on the spot and make an example of him and show him never to do it again, or he has to spend so much time in prison because he committed a crime, we can just, we can be, throwing stones at this kid. We can, play judge, jury, and executioner on the same spot, while we can actually take out this young man who may, for all we know, may have been the victim of a poor understanding, but we don't know that for sure. We don't know exactly what happened on those on that point. I want to shift focus away on something here. The other reason I think is important to discuss on this show is just recently, Larry Pratt, the Gun Owners of America executive director, whom you wrote on your blog about, made some very, very distasteful comments about Muslims. And
hold on. There's some really serious static on the.
There is. Oh,
yeah.
I think it's coming from you, Todd.
Oh, that's because. Okay. I don't know how to fix that, but we'll see how it goes. But
it's gone now.
Oh, it's gone now? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this is what Larry Pratt had to say, and we can endure about 2 minutes of this, give or take. Actually, almost 3 minutes. Here's what he said. Here's Larry Pratt.
Recently, Jan Morgan, who has been on my show twice, and who is a national firearms instructor and a champion of gun rights, just as yourself, recently caused quite a stir when she announced publicly that for her safety and the safety of her patrons at the Gun Cave shooting range that she owns, she will no longer allow Muslims to shoot in her establishment.
I believe. Well, you know, yes. After what a Muslim convert about a year and a half did to a woman in Oklahoma, might give us some pause, because the guy had heard a Friday sermon, either the same Friday or the Friday before, I'm not clear on that. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the imam had preached on Muhammad says that we need to behead the infidel. And so was acting on what he had heard preached. So I think Mrs. Morgan is on very sound ground.
I would agree.
I know there'll be a lot of people that will be outraged at that, but we don't facilitate murderers. And if you read the Quran, it's an instruction to go kill people, lots of them. Mm-hmm. And you know, if there are Muslims who don't buy into that, well, how do I know which one you are?
Right, and I put a post out there on Facebook late last night, and I explained the details of this case, where basically you had two Middle Eastern men go into the gun cave, and they were looking around. They were very suspicious, walking around. They wanted to rent high-powered rifles, and they wanted to be able to shoot them, which is fine. But then one of their cell phones rang, and the ring on their cell phone was Allah Akbar. Okay? No, I'm serious. And it was over and over, Allah Akbar, Allah, over and over and over. So immediately, you know, Jan's not a dummy. She knows what that means. So already there's a hint of radicalism in your midst. And then the other person that was with the other person was looking around and kind of like scanning the place and scoping it out, if you will, and looking at all the cameras. Now, after that happened, Jan noticed that people and patrons started to leave because they got nervous. So they started to leave her establishment. That
Muslims
caused her
are bad for business as well as bad for public safety.
Exactly. So she did the right thing. I commend her. I think she's a brave patriot for doing it. She had the guts to do it. And it's her establishment. It's not the government's establishment. It's Jan Morgan's establishment. She can do what she wants in her own business.
You know
That's
what?
her right.
Glad we're talking about this. This discussion has just put in my mind that Gun Owners of America ought to have some kind of an award that we give out, and she ought to get it.
Now, you wrote about that entire interview on your blog, Will, and also on Lou Rockwell's blog. More on Lou's blog, that is. But I guess what really comes to mind is, how is it that somehow this person who is a Muslim would have a ringtone that would cry out Allah Akbar? I mean, come on.
No, it's pretty normal. It's pretty normal, actually. It was probably time for him to pray. Lots of Muslims have like these prayer alarms on their phones. And the call to prayer is Allahu Akbar, La ilaha. You know, like that's how the call to prayer starts. So I mean, it's completely, you know, rational that some guys, you know, there and the call to prayer comes across his phone and he just reaches down and shuts it off. I mean, it happens in the middle of prayer at the mosque all the time.
Well,
the ringing of the church bells?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what does Allah Akbar really mean? Well,
God is great. It's like the
God
Shema from Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord, our God, the Lord is one. It's that same kind of an invocation, if I'm not mistaken. Not being a Muslim and not being a Jew, I can't speak to that with authority. But I do think that there's, and something that I've been trying to explain to my fellow Christians here is that there are probably at least 100 million or so Christians who, when they pray, use the name Allah to refer to the deity because it's, if you will, the generic equivalent of God in the Arabic language. There are some beautiful hymns of the Nativity that were performed by people of the Coptic Christian faith that I have on my hard drive that I play during the Christmas season that use Allah as the name title of the deity. It's not as if you're talking about something that's completely foreign to the Western experience. So I don't know what, apart from this cultivated sense of paranoid unease over the very existence of Muslims, would lead somebody to react the way that these people reacted in that Hot Springs gun shooting range, the way that they did. When Larry Pratt says the Muslims are bad for business as well as for public safety, he's, of course, retailing something that is thoroughly and unmistakably the product of bigotry. But more to the point here, he lied about what happened in Oklahoma. Alton Nolan was a quote-unquote convert to Islam, in the same sense that you could say that people who were in loose orbit around certain evangelical congregations could be called converts to Christianity. But he was by no means doctrinaire or devout in the Muslim faith. He was somebody who had a lot of trouble, according to the people I've spoken with from that congregation, with white people. He was a violent, paroled ex-con. I think he was working at Von Foods as part of some kind of a parole program. And he was ill-suited to the job. He couldn't get along with his coworkers, in large measure because of his own racial hang-ups. So he was fired for cause. And in a fit of unfiltered fury over being fired, he went back to his former place of employment and killed a former coworker. It had nothing to do with religious motivations. It had nothing to do with jihad. This was a loosely wrapped, violent person who'd already committed violent crimes, descending basically to the lowest impulses, giving free expression to the lowest impulses of his personality. And this attempted beheading had about as much to do with his nominal Islamic faith as the murder of O.J. Simpson's ex-wife would have had to do with O.J. Simpson's nominal religious faith, or the religious faith of the real killers. You know, take your pick as to what happened in that specific incident. You know, Nicole Brown Simpson was killed by somebody who nearly beheaded her, and that didn't have anything to do with Islam or the Southern Baptist denomination of Christianity or any of the religious faith. It was an act of violence. But the thing that most sticks between teeth and gum for me is the fact that Larry Pratt, speaking with unwarranted certainty, says that this was something that was inspired by a Friday sermon at that mosque. Well, as it happens, Dr. Imad Inchasi, Dr. Inchasi, who is the imam presiding over the Islamic Society of Greater Oklahoma City, which is a mosque sometimes attended by Alton Nolan, has made a point of archiving and making publicly available all of his Friday sermons, and not a single one of them has anything to say about beheading anybody for any reason. During the weeks leading up to that horrible killing, which had nothing to do with Dr. Inchasi or anybody in his congregation, he was preaching a series of sermons that were recognizably teachings that resonate with the Sermon on the Mount in Christianity about doing well by your neighbors, doing good deeds to your neighbors, speaking kindly to them, behaving as a child of Abraham and doing the works of Abraham, which include serving others and loving others and exercising forbearance in the face of provocation. There has never been an incident of any kind at that mosque where anybody for any reason has incited violence against anybody to any purpose. And Larry Pratt either didn't know this, in which case he was simply retailing gossip, or he knew that what he said was untrue, in which case he's a damn liar.
Right.
But the point that I'm making here is that this is the sort of thing that plays into these presuppositions about what we're told is the irreducibly violent nature of all Muslims everywhere. And what I would like to ask Larry Pratt, and I posed this question to him through direct messages and other means, and he's not deigned to respond to me, is, does he believe that individual Muslims have a right to armed self-defense? He's said on a couple of occasions, he's written a couple of pieces years ago, talking about the idea that all Muslims everywhere are seething, roiling masses of barely controlled violence, and that any time any one of them is going to detonate in what he calls an example of sudden jihad syndrome.
Well,
if that's the case, if these people are unmistakably and insuperably our enemy, does he believe that they have, as individuals, the right to armed self-defense? And if not, why not? And if they don't, then he doesn't really believe in an innate right to armed self-defense. He's not, in other words, somebody who champions the unconditional right to keep and bear arms. There are conditions he's put on it that are defined by ideology and religion.
Well, here's the thing that really gets to me. There was a case, we talked about this several days ago, you, me, and Will in private, and we were talking about this young man who is 21 years old. He goes by the name of Isaiah Marin. Called 911 and said, I murdered someone before being caught Wednesday afternoon, covered in blood and still armed with a large blade on Stillwater, Oklahoma street. The victim, 19-year-old Jacob Crockett, was a friend of his alleged killer, and his head was mostly severed from the body, according to the police. The pair had argued previously over the victims practicing witchcraft. Now, keep in mind, this is a practicing Christian killing a young kid who is allegedly a practicing witch. So, which makes me wonder, gee, Larry Pratt, did you actually even pay attention to this story, too, while you were at it? I mean, this is a story that Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, and CNBC never even talked about. There was never a big investigation. I mean, you could never even imagine seeing this on Wolf Blitzer's show, or even on Hannity, for crying out loud, or even on Bill O'Reilly, for that matter. I mean, I wonder, you know, this was motivated and predicated on religious hatred of a young kid because of his psychotic beliefs. What do you say to that? I mean, what does anybody say to that?
This is an interesting case for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that it happened in Oklahoma. You actually have in the same state two cases involving assaults that resulted in near decapitation, one of which manifestly had nothing to do with the punitive religious beliefs of the assailant, and that would be the case of Alton Nolan. The second, according to the assailant, was motivated by his religious beliefs, which happened to be some kind of vaguely defined Pentecostal variant of Christianity from what I can tell. And the victim in that second case was accused, as you say, of practicing witchcraft, but I don't think that's because he was actually involved in Wicca. I think it was because he was involved in heavy metal. And the two of them, Isaiah Marin and the victim, had both been involved at one point, from what I understand, in a band of some sort that had been a falling out. And Mr. Marin has a really tragic background. His father was killed in much the same way by a hired hitman employed by his estranged mother, the ex-wife, killed when they were living in Texas. And so he's dealing probably with a number of really tragic and, as we see, highly combustible psychological problems on top of whatever religious or spiritual element might be present here. He's just a very confused and loosely wrapped young man. But you did have him taking specific responsibility for the crime in religious terms, and this is the sort of thing that if I were inclined to be a critic of the Christian faith rather than an adherent thereof, I would say this is obviously an outgrowth of some of the things you read in that hyper-violent book called the Old Testament, where in the book of Exodus it says, "Thou shalt not allow a witch to live." I mean, obviously, every Christian believes that at some point he's probably going to have to kill a witch. But it turns out that the passage in the book of Exodus has more to do with people who practice poisoning than people who practice witchcraft. But leaving that to the side, you've got here a test case. You've got two really very similar cases occurring in the same state within a couple of weeks of each other. The first one was seized upon by the people I call compulsive mosque baiters to say that all Muslims everywhere are inescapably our enemy, and this is what they love to do to us all the time. That's their ever-waking thought. It's the first thing they think about when they wake up. It's the last thing that they think about before they go to bed at night, how much they want to behead infidels, which, of course, is nonsense on stilts. But you have this other case that's not been touched by anybody, as you point out, in the so-called mainstream media. You didn't see any of the religious leaders in the state of Oklahoma rush to the microphone to denounce this, the way that they're always demanding that Muslims denounce any crime that's committed anywhere on the planet that receives any publicity by a Muslim. Every time there's something that happens that implicates Muslims in bad behavior, we're asked theatrically, where are the moderate Muslims? Why are they condemning this? Well, chances are it's because they're living their own lives. They've got children to raise. They've got bills to pay. They don't get regular updates through some kind of a guilt-inducing app telling them,
top of that,
Muslim did something. A Muslim did something bad today. Now you have to tie yourself in knots of contrition over something you had nothing to do with.
Right. On top of that, they don't get the kind of representation in the media like Christians do. I mean, they don't the best form of representation that I'm seeing right now and coming from is thanks to, Will here and Muslims for Liberty. But outside of that, unless you go to the conventions like CARES conventions and whatnot, you have there are just no outlets for a lot of Muslims out there to actually, to comment on these kinds of cases or deal with these kinds of cases, because the media automatically assumes, gee, these are the kind of people you see on Homeland with Claire Danes. Because I mean, remember Carrie, the bipolar chick, the CIA chick, who's in Islamabad, and I mean these are Muslims, they must be riding on camels. So there.
You ought to see some of the looks me and my wife get when we go out, because I grew up in Appalachia, so I look like a local, and my wife is from Nairobi, so she does not look like a local at all. So, like, when they see they see me come in with two of the kids, and they're like, "Oh, how sweet!" And then they see her come in with the other kid. They just they stop for a second and they just look like, "What the hell just happened?" They just can't wrap their head around y'all are. And these are you. What? But you're.
Now,
huh?
Do you have an Oreo cookie family as I do?
Yeah.
Because I married a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, very fair-complexioned woman, and we have 6 kids, and 3 of them take after me in terms of physiognomy, and 3 of them take after her. And I'm from a family of 6 adopted children in which I'm conspicuous as being the only brown one. So everywhere we would go, people would ask, "Are you with them?" And I'd say, "Yeah, permanently." But we got the same situation with Corinne and me and our children that you're describing here. And it's either
kind of the
a
same
source
way
of
with
amusement or a source of frustration.
Yeah, it's kind of the same way with the kids, but we're working on number 4 will be here in March, inshallah. A little girl finally, yeah. But Shuaib looks like his mother, and Jalaluddin and Hamza look like me. Well, Hamza looks like Shuaib, but he's light skinned and has light hair. But they look exactly the same. They look like twins. They're just different complexions and different hair colors.
Right. Does anybody else have any questions for Will on this subject? How about you, John Carlos Screws? Any questions for him?
You know, I don't really have any questions per se. I think you did an excellent job of addressing everything that needs to be.
Okay. How about any more questions from you, Jim Babb?
Yes, I have a question for Will and for both Wills, actually. First, I just wanted to mention the Muslims for Liberty at PorcFest this past summer was absolutely incredible. Thank you, Will Coley, for providing such hospitality and wonderful food for the entire festival while you were there. That was fantastic.
I thought I recognized your voice.
that was excellent, and I know that everybody really enjoyed it. And my question for Will Grigg is, will you be coming to PorcFest so you can experience this firsthand this summer?
I feel, first of all, both deprived and ashamed that I haven't been able to. And it's my aspiration to do that if I have the material means to do so, because as I've read accounts of PorcFest and seen the videos, I've received feedback from it. It sounds like it would be a perfectly wonderful, immersive experience for me and my kids, and it would probably be a really good way to introduce them to the concept of being self-directed and not being ruled, which I think is something we need to teach everybody. So if I can, I'd love to be there.
Well, let's put it another way. I know that there are countless people that would also want you to be there. I know you don't fly, so you're talking about just an incredible commitment just in traveling time. But if the material costs of transportation were met by interested people like myself and so many others I know, maybe we could talk you into investing that much time. I know that's a pretty serious commitment that you don't have to make now, but maybe we'll throw a chip in or a GoFundMe or something up there and just say, we need like $3,000 to get the Griggs out here this year.
That'd be wonderful, and I'm very persuadable.
Okay.
Hey, that works. You can always talk to Carla.
I have yet to try your cuisine, Will, so trust me. I've had hummus because of the Muslim population here, but I bet I will tell you right now, Middle Eastern food is the bomb.
It is.
I mean, it is
well,
great.
Using it that way is a little bit dangerous.
Yeah. In these troubled times, you can't even say that phrase anymore. But
be careful with your superlatives.
But I guess the other question I have for you, Will, is what's next for Will Grigg right now? I mean, is he going to write a book? Is he going to show up at Libertopia? I mean, hey, I hear Libertopia is going to be doing some more stuff next year. What about not just PorcFest, since you've been already directly or indirectly invited to it already, but how about the Liberty Forum in New Hampshire? Would you you got any plans on the Libertarian Alliance?
I've not really made any plans for the Liberty Forum, and Libertopia, unfortunately, is something I'm not going to be able to do. I do have a long gestating book project. As a matter of fact, it's about time to induce labor on that thing. It's been about a year or so that I've been waiting to hear about it. It's going to be a fairly sizable book, and the working title is No Quarter, and that, of course, is an allusion to Mencken's famous quote about how at some point every decent man wants to hoist the black flag and spit on his hands and start slitting throats. I'm trying to reconcile that with a non-aggression principle. That's going to be an interesting task. But yes, I do have that book project that's sort of in advance, and hopefully at some point in the near future I'll be able to give you some more information about that. I've got a couple of documentary projects that are sort of on the back burner. That all has to do with resources and time. One of them is a film that I want to do about some really horrible things that have happened here in the state of Idaho in the realm of police abuse. You could do this anywhere, practically anywhere in the Soyuz. You're going to be able to go out with a basket and gather the manna, if you will, of information of that sort, and from it assemble a very compelling documentary. But that's something that's also been on the back burner now for a number of months. And in terms of where I'm going to go in the movement to attend these meetings, I'd love to attend all of them if I had time and means to do so. There are certain things that are inescapable in my situation. I mentioned we have 6 kids. That, of course, is a tremendous and priority commitment. That is the commitment against which everything else I do is measured. And my wife's health circumstances do limit what I can do as well. I don't want to get into the details, but there are rather severe limits placed on us because of a condition, an incurable condition here, as it turns out. I've probably said more than would be prudent in saying here, but that does limit what I can do, and that does impose certain limitations on how far I can travel and how long I can stay in the house, that kind of thing.
Right.
But, I'm just delighted beyond expression to see, first of all, that the liberty movement is propagating itself so dramatically among that element of the population, the people on the sunshine side of 35 particularly, that are probably the most important to our society's future. And secondly, it's interesting that, as I said about a year ago, I predicted that this would be the year when people would finally have a surfeit of police abuse and they'd lose the mandate of heaven, to use the Chinese expression. And we've seen that happen. We've seen a real sea change in public perceptions of law enforcement that I think is badly overdue. That's not to say that we're anywhere near the end of the quarrel right now. We're seeing a tremendous pushback, as you well know, from police unions and police organizations. Right. Where if you post something on Facebook that is derogatory to the police, you could be fired if you're a short order cook from Santa Quin, Utah. We just saw that happen. But we're not quite to the point of what I call peak jackboot yet, but I think that we're getting there. So that gives us some ironic, I think, cause for optimism, albeit of a dark variety.
Approaching peak jackboot, and that's our cause of optimism.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about a couple of more things, but before I do that, Will, do you have any other questions for Will Grigg?
Well, I actually wanted to ask him, have you read some of your comments earlier that you were talking about, like how many, like, will people allow the jackbooted thug with the costume and the stick to beat a man in the street? Have you read Authoritarian Sociopathy by Dobby Barker yet?
Not yet. I need to. That's one I definitely should make a priority.
Yeah. The whole concept is to do underground, like agorist psychological experimentation to see how often would a civilian stop a police officer from basically beating a person to death in the street.
Yeah, I actually saw a presentation about that in Phoenix earlier this year, and I was really excited by that because that's what you have to do in order to, I hate to use the expression, but I think it's apposite, reprogram people, to dispense with the trappings of this mystical fiction called authority and take a look at what one person is doing to another. But I haven't read that yet, but I need to. I read a very short treatment of the subject, and I was intrigued by it, very excited by what they're doing.
He's our, I guess you would call him, like, Muslims for Liberty is run like by anarchists, pretty much. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of run like anarchists would run something. So, like, we all have titles, but they really don't mean anything.
Right.
Dobby's the quote-unquote second in command, basically, because he does all the writing.
And, I have to...
We are.
And I have to admit, I love Dobby's writing. I think he's spectacular, and he has done such an awesome job with the contents and with the setup of Muslims for Liberty website. Well, so
he's the editor at the Daily Anarchist too. So like that's his puppy over there.
Right.
All that stuff at Daily Anarchist is.
Yeah, you know, I guess one. I was going to ask you a couple of questions, but I want to cut it down to one question, which is, what do you think is going to be the big issue for 2016? We've already seen with the police abuse going on here. As you're probably aware of, Stefan Molyneux basically sided with the state on the Michael Brown incident and what happened. And he completely went to warp speed in an opposite direction as far as I'm concerned. And now that with the whole situation going on in Iran and Iraq and throughout the whole Middle East, you know, there is this concerted effort to go after ISIS and, you know, taking them out and everything. Do you think that Americans are becoming more and more, growing much more warier of the state now, more so than, say, when Ron Paul was running for president in 2012 and even before that in 2008?
I think there's been a severe cleavage, if you will, in the public between those who are innately inclined toward rebellion against the state. You know, by innate, I mean people who've either thought it through or just are wired in such a way that they're suspicious of this thing called authority. And those who can be gulled or persuaded or browbeaten, threatened, cajoled into supporting the state, and as long as the state focuses its hostility on an acceptable hate target, the old Lenin who does what to whom idea, as long as they're the who rather than the whom, they're not really all that concerned about what the state does rather than focusing on the what of that equation, which is how individualists of various stripes look at it. The important thing is what is being done, not the who and the whom in the equation. So every time you have an ISIS rear up on the horizon, there are people who say, okay, well, here's somebody who deserves the full attention of this lethal mechanism called the state. Or when you have something like the riots in Ferguson, they say, oh, look, these people obviously are not suited for liberty. Maybe at some point in some ideal society they might be, but as long as there are people like that in the world, we better well have people like Darren Wilson who will be the human barricade between the forces of civilization and the forces of what they call anarchy, things like that.
Right.
And I think that you probably have a larger plurality of people who meet the authoritarian model than people who meet the individualist model right now. And I think between now and 2016, there's going to be a concerted effort by statists of a couple of different varieties, statists of different brand names, to reinvigorate the who-whom paradigm. For the left, for the MSNBC left, of course, it's always the Koch brothers. It's always the people in the private sector who are discriminating against gays and lesbians and others. You know, they're the real enemy. They're the people who should be the focus of state attention. For people, the statists of the Fox News variety, it's the illegal immigrants, it's the Muslims, and so forth. We're coming up, on a presidential election. That's when we reach the apex of the nadir, I guess is a better description.
Or the John Boltons or the Bill Maher's of the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're in their separate ways equally repulsive, and sometimes I think it'd be great if we could take John Bolton and Bill Maher and sew them in a sleeping bag with a rattlesnake and hurl them into the Tiber or something. Non-aggression. I'm a pacifist. I have to remember that. You know, even people like that need to be persuaded rather than beaten.
Or put them in a sleeping bag with a rattlesnake in self-defense.
I don't know. I think that'd be pretty persuasive.
That would be a persuasive measure there. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's been a pleasure having you with us. I mean, I know we went over time.
I've enjoyed it too. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, no problem. And, keep fighting the good fight. Any more interesting stuff coming from Larry Pratt, please keep us advised. I'll tell you right now.
From me.
Because I'll tell you right now, after hearing what Larry Pratt, a little unfortunate circumstance happened yesterday where I wasn't able to interview him, but he wanted a half-hour interview anyway, and there was not much I was going to get out of him in a half hour anyway. So, it's made me cause to think whether I should, continue supporting gun owners of America. And I don't say on the broadcast here right now that if Larry Pratt's going to be making any statements, GOA can kiss my membership renewals goodbye after this point, because
I've heard more than a few people say that actually.
And I'm I'm the next person to say that. So I'll let this membership go. I'll let it keep going. But after this point, I think this is my last time I'm giving my membership renewal to GOA. So there you have it. Thank you so much, Will. You're awesome. Keep up the good fight. And
okay, thank you so much. You take care.
You too. That was Will Grigg, everybody, and he is one hell of a guy here.
What a gem, man!
Gem. I know.
Really knows his stuff.
He really.
And it's not just that what he knows; it's how he expresses himself in his words, in writing and in speaking. He's just a master wordsmith, and I can't think of anybody else that puts these thoughts together better than he does.
I know. Isn't that fantastic or what?
We are so lucky to have him on our team.
I know. We are so lucky to have him on our team.